Joining me now is American financial analyst, stockbroker, author, CEO, and chief global strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital, Peter Schiff. He joins us now to talk about the global economy, the U.S. election, the Fed's latest move to print trillions of dollars more in quantitative easing, the death of Obamacare on the horizon, and the latest geopolitical tensions. Peter, welcome back to the Next News Network.
Oh, thanks for having me on again.
Absolutely. Now, North Korea just fired a ballistic missile from its submarine off its east coast. It's according to the U.S. and South Korea. Tensions are escalating between the West and China. China has ignored the international community and continues to militarize the Chinese triangle there. Vietnam now moving missiles into the region. Japan becoming more aggressive, retooling its constitution. The Philippines military bases are active again with U.S. soldiers. If war were to break out in the South China Sea, how will this affect Americans who have become absolutely dependent on cheap goods from Asia?
Well, certainly America is in no position to afford a war. I mean, we're really in no position to afford peace. That's how broke we are. But certainly anything that would require the expenditure of more resources that we don't have would simply add to our problems. The government would have to run even larger deficits to absorb those costs, which means it would have to print more money. The Fed would have to create more money to monetize those deficits because Americans don't have the savings. It's not like World War II where we can go sell bonds and the American public is going to write checks. American public is broke. They have lousy jobs or they have no job at all. They can barely survive. They can't afford to pay their own bills, let alone the government's bills. So we're very, very vulnerable to any kind of increase in government spending. But even if there is no war, we're still going to have a financial crisis worse than 2008 because of the problems that already exist, let alone how much worse they would be to the extent that we had some overseas conflict to deal with.
Now, Hillary Clinton, she's a critic of for-profit schools. She's pledging in speeches across the country to crack down on predatory schools and help students drowning in student loan debt. Bill Clinton, as you know, he earned $17.6 million from the world's largest for-profit education company, Laureate Education. Now, do you believe Hillary, is she really going to help students drowning in student debt, or is this just a play for the burned Bernie supporters?
Well, unfortunately, politicians have been taking advantage of students for a long time. I mean, the problem is they're very young in general, and so they don't really have a lot of understanding of how the real world works because they've never really had jobs. They've lived with their parents, and they're very idealistic. And they also get very apprehensive about their future. And so what's happened is politicians have driven up the cost of education because of their subsidies. Because of the involvement of government, education is very expensive. And now, because it's so expensive, young people don't know how they're going to be able to go. And then the government comes and says, oh, we have a solution. We'll arrange cheap financing. We'll let you borrow a lot of money to pay the high cost of tuition. And it's all this debt that keeps driving tuitions higher and higher. And then, of course, conveniently, the government comes out and says, oh, we'll help you with even more loans. Basically, what happens is the government cripples the students and now offers the students a crutch. And the students believe that but for the government, they'd have no crutch and they couldn't walk. But if it wasn't for the government, they wouldn't need a crutch because it's government that makes education so expensive. But more than making it expensive, it actually destroys the quality of the education. So you're not even getting any value for what you're buying. But a lot of young people have been scared into believing that if they don't go to college and get a degree, their life is ruined. And so they end up borrowing a tremendous amount of money to get a worthless degree. And now the politicians could get their votes by promising to solve a problem that they created. Hillary Clinton is not going to solve the problem. Hillary Clinton will simply make the problem worse.
Now, Hillary Clinton's emails have revealed a woman seeking solutions to a series of critical health problems, including a cracked skull and even seeking out Parkinson's medication for extreme exhaustion. Now, the media certainly is working overtime to discount any questions of her health as simply conspiracy theory, even while respected doctors are raising some very serious concerns. Now, aside from her national security failures, which I think we can agree on, which certainly should exclude her from running altogether. Given the recent revelations of her health, should the American people be concerned about her health crisis?
Well, I mean, the health is the least of my concerns. I mean, maybe if she got really sick, she couldn't do as much damage. I'm more worried about a healthy Hillary Clinton and what she can do than a sick Hillary, because the real problem is what she's going to do, what her policies are going to be. I mean, she's a very corrupt individual. I mean, she's basically running a criminal enterprise with her husband, Bill. They entered politics broke, and now they have a net worth of over $100 million. I mean, they did that by peddling their influence, and they were doing it in a way that was probably detrimental to the interest of the American public. And now they're trying to escalate that by moving Hillary into the White House. I can only imagine how much money the Clintons stand to gain if they can get back into the White House again. I mean, look how much they made just having Hillary be the Secretary of State. Imagine, what it's going to be if she's president, or what they made when she was a senator. I mean, she's going to have far more influence to peddle. I'm sure it's going to be a lot more expensive to bribe Hillary once she's president, but obviously that's going to continue. So I want to keep her out of office. I'm not, the health issue, as far as I'm concerned, is a sideshow to the main event of the fact that she is incompetent and a very dangerous woman to be president of the United States.
Donald Trump now, he's made criticizing international trade deals like NAFTA and the TPP a centerpiece of his campaign. Hillary, on the other hand, she supports those trade agreements. Will the Trump administration be able to bring back jobs and pull America from these agreements? Are these international trade deals good for America?
Well, the agreements are not the problem. I'm not saying that these are the best agreements and that they couldn't be renegotiated more favorably. I'd just like to have unilateral free trade. These agreements are managed trade because they're enormous. I mean, they're very thick. There's lots of papers there. Free trade wouldn't require that volume of paperwork. But we're not going to restore America's greatness unless we go back to what made America great in the first place. So it's not as simple as just better negotiators sitting across from the Chinese or the Mexicans. We need massive restructuring here at home, and that means huge cuts in government spending. We need to eliminate entire departments and agencies. We need to basically tear up all these regulations that have been enacted over the years. We need to make government much smaller. We actually need cuts in entitlements, something that Donald Trump is promising not to do. We're going to need that. We're going to need to reform our tax code. We're going to need lower taxes. We're going to have to focus taxing on consumption and not taxing savings and investment and production. So we need to do a lot of things. We can do those things, but so far I don't hear any of the politicians actually talking about what needs to be done, and nor do I know that any of them have the stomach for swallowing the bitter tasting medicine that we need to swallow if we're ever going to have a healthy economy again.
Aetna now, they've announced that they're going to be ditching Obamacare. Do you think Obamacare is going to split in half to remain on life support?
Well, Obamacare was a very predictable disaster. I mean, all the problems that are going wrong with Obamacare were things that I forecast, that I wrote about and spoke about years ago when they first enacted this. And the fact that everything is happening precisely the way I said, just further supports the underlying thesis. This is a disaster, and it's just going to eventually lead to the collapse, I think, of our healthcare system, and the government is going to then take advantage of the damage that it caused to probably nationalize the entire thing and go to some type of single-payer socialized medicine. And maybe that was the plan all along, to poison the well and then take advantage of what happened. But, it's not just the government's health care plan that it's a disaster. Everything the government does is a disaster. I think what the Federal Reserve has done is going to be a bigger disaster. Everybody believes that the quantitative easing and cheap money was a success. It's as much a success as Obamacare. In fact, it's probably even a bigger failure, and it's going to cost us even more when the consequences become more widely known and appreciated.
Now, you just mentioned the Federal Reserve. They admit they need another $4 trillion in quantitative easing to offset an economic shock. Those are their words. Will this simply be a Houdini act to offset an economic shock and just kick the can down the road? What's going to happen to the House of Cards?
Well, they're talking about what they might do in the next economic downturn, which I believe has already begun. I think we're already in a recession. It's just that nobody wants to acknowledge that fact, certainly with an election coming up where Hillary is promising 4 more years of Obama. They don't want to admit that we're already back in recession, because who would want 4 more years of recession? But I don't think that there's any amount of quantitative easing that's going to get us out of this. I don't care if they go 4 trillion or 40 trillion. It's not going to work. It can't work. It's like trying to drink yourself sober. That doesn't happen. The more you drink, the drunker you get. What we need is detox. We need to go cold turkey. But unfortunately, the problems have built up so large over so many years that that's going to be a very painful trip to rehab. But that's why none of the politicians or the bankers want to accept reality, because they don't want to acknowledge how big a mistake they've made and how much trouble we're now in because of what they've done.
Taking a look at the Brexit, how is a weaker UK pound bolstering the country's industrial export orders to a record not seen since 2014?
Well, look, a weak pound is not going to help the UK. I mean, it just makes their imports more expensive, and it means they get less for their exports. And certainly, you're going to export more when your exports go on sale. But, the goal is not to have to mark down your exports. You want to get, top dollar for them so that you don't have to work as hard to pay for your imports. So the weakening pound is not going to help the UK. What would help the UK is getting out of the EU, because then maybe they won't have as many regulations and they'll have a freer market, and then they can have a stronger economy and eventually have a stronger British pound.
Now, Deutsche Bank, they're shutting down hundreds of branches in Germany, causing great concern. And of course, the Russian desk now apparently helped to move $10 billion offshore through something called a mirror trading scheme. First of all, what is a mirror trading scheme? And then what do you believe is the ripple effect of the Deutsche Bank collapse?
Well, I really don't know. And I don't know what the effect is going to be. I mean, Deutsche Bank, hasn't completely collapsed. The stock has certainly gone down. We're actually below the 2008 financial crisis lows. And I think there's problems not only in those European banks, and Deutsche Bank is not the only one that's had a substantial decline. There are a lot of banks that have seen similar drops. I think there's a lot of problems with our banks. And I think we just haven't been dealing with it yet. And I don't think this is something that's isolated to European banks. But, who knows where the dominoes are going to, end up and what the collateral damage is going to be. But obviously what's going on is certainly a sign that there are big problems here. And it's particularly, I think, the backlash with respect to the quantitative easing programs and the negative interest rate programs that are going on in Europe, and how this is affecting the banking industry.
Italy now could prove to be actually the next nation to leave the Brussels bloc. That's according to Mr. Stiglitz. He's a former chief economist of the World Bank, also a Clinton insider now. He says an amicable divorce must be considered to avoid a political cataclysmic event like the Brexit. Why must a divorce be considered to avoid economic doom there in the Eurozone?
Well, I don't know, ultimately. And a lot of scapegoating is going on. You have a lot of problems now in Europe, and it's easy to blame it on the European Union. But look, Italy had a lot of problems before they joined the EU. I mean, the countries that really should be complaining should be Germany. I mean, Germany was in much better shape and would be in much better shape had they not created this ridiculous union. And, I criticized it from the very beginning because I understood exactly the moral hazards that were being unleashed, and all the things that I was writing about and talking about in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when I wrote about what was going to happen as a result of this plan. Again, just like Obamacare, all this stuff is happening for the reasons that I said it would happen. So, but just leaving, if a country wants to just get out of the EU, but just preserve their own independent, anti-competitive, big government, social welfare state policies, getting out is not going to be a panacea. The problem is the government and the deficits and the regulations that everybody has now based on their membership of the EU. I mean, the EU was supposed to rein all that in. It was supposed to keep a check on government, but it hasn't done that. Because of the moral hazards, all these countries who are sharing the euro currency and are in this union have been able to run constant deficits. And it's actually been enabling local politicians to promise even more free stuff to the voters than they might have been able to promise if they didn't have the backstop of the European Central Bank.
Now, post-Brexit, we're seeing federalism rise in the Eurozone in an attempt to keep the states in line with policies and regulations. There's now discussion of a standing EU army. We've reported here how Germany is actually beginning to absorb some of the militaries in Europe. Meanwhile, of course, populist movements are pushing back. What do you believe is going to be the ultimate fate of the Eurozone and, of course, the standing army of Europe?
Well, I do think eventually that it will change dramatically. And I do think that more nations will leave. And I think ultimately there will be fewer countries that share the common currency. But I don't believe it's going to go away. I think the euro will be there. I just won't have as many nations a part of it. That's probably the way it's going to ultimately go down. But, it's not just the European Union that's in trouble. I think the United States, we're a union of 50 states. And I think our union is even more trouble than the European Union. Not necessarily that it's going to break apart, like the Civil War days, where states are going to try to secede from the Union. I don't know that it's going to come to that, but I'm certainly most states would be better off economically if they could do that. But the U.S. government militarily probably won't allow that. But I do think that our union is going to see some major problems with respect to the economy, the value of the dollar, our standard of living. So, while a lot of people want to speculate as to what's going to happen with the European Union, it's the American Union that I think is much more troubling and certainly much more of much greater interest to most of the people that I deal with.
Shifting gears into Pittsburgh now, they're going to be hosting Uber's driverless pilot program. If self-driving cars are eventually perfected, how do you believe this is going to affect taxis, bus drivers, truckers, etc., and that specific marketplace?
Well, it will clearly put a lot of truck drivers and cab drivers out of work. Right now, I think the most common job for men in America is truck driver. That more men are employed as truck drivers than in any other occupation. And if we have, autonomous trucks, those truck drivers will be unemployed. Now, that is a good development. I mean, I think the world will be much better off with autonomous cars. I mean, just think about it from your own perspective. If you didn't have to drive, if your car just drove itself, I mean, that means you could sit in your car and you could do work. You could watch a movie, or you could be productive. It wouldn't be dead time. Think of all the people that commute back and forth to work. They could be working during that commute, so people could be a lot more productive. I mean, think about traffic. And what about all the accidents? I mean, more people die in traffic accidents than probably from any other cause. Obviously, if we have autonomous vehicles, we will cut down dramatically on fatalities. We certainly won't have to worry about drunk driving. People will be able to go out, drink whatever they want, and just get right back into their car. So this is going to be a big positive. I mean, think about trucks, too. Trucks will be able to drive on the road 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You won't have drivers that have to go to rest stops and then sleep. And then it's very complicated, too, when you're a truck driver, to keep track of how many hours you're allowed to drive and when you have to rest. So trucks will be much more efficient when they can operate 24/7. A lot of families, they won't have to have two cars. A husband and wife can have one car because the car could drop one person off and come back and pick another person up, drop another person off. Your car could be working for you. You won't have to operate it. So I think it is going to be great for human beings. It's going to be great for our collective standard of living to be, to no longer have the drudgery of having to drive, to let our automobiles and trucks drive on their own without having to be operated by a human being. So it's a good thing overall, but certainly people are going to have to deal with the reality that if you're a truck driver or a cab driver, you're going to have to do something else, just like people that manufactured buggy whips had to do something else when the automobile came along. It wasn't that it was a bad idea to have automobiles. It was a positive development, but for the buggy whip manufacturers, obviously it was a problem. So people are going to have to deal with this. But what's a big problem in the United States is because of all the taxes and all the regulations that we have, the U.S. government is going to make it more difficult for unemployed taxi drivers or truck drivers to get better jobs and to get other jobs. And that's why we need to dismantle the government, because we have to prepare for this, technological improvements. We have to make it easier for people who are displaced to find other work. but the government is going to interfere with that. But the problem is not technology or advancement. The problem is government.
Now, this election has been quite a wild ride so far. Of course, the DNC email hacks creating so much havoc for the Democrats. Trump's meteoric destruction of the Republican neocons. We're seeing an exodus of all of the Bushite individuals there. What are your thoughts on the election this year? Are you going to be casting a vote for Hillary?
Well, look, the biggest problem with the election is somebody's going to win, right? That's always the problem. And I think that between the two, I think Hillary is going to be do more damage than Trump. Now, I don't necessarily believe that a lot of the things Trump is stumping about on the campaign trail, I don't actually believe that a lot of these things are going to happen. But I think Donald Trump probably has a better chance of doing the right thing as president than Hillary Clinton, where I think she has no chance of doing the right thing. I think Donald Trump can be reasoned with, and I think he might surround himself by much better people than will Hillary Clinton. And I think he has a good understanding in general about how bad the problem is and how government is at the root cause of it. Not all of the prescriptions that he's advocating are the right ones, but he's on the right track. And so I would much rather see him as president than Hillary Clinton. Of course, there is a third choice. There is, Gary Johnson running as a libertarian. And of course, that's a long shot, but who knows? I mean, if enough people vote for Johnson, then maybe they throw the election into the House of Representatives, and he could end up being the compromise candidate. Now, Gary Johnson isn't perfect either. I've got things that I disagree with on Gary Johnson. But if you look at everything in totality, Gary Johnson would be the candidate with whom I disagree the least. So I guess I would say Gary Johnson would be my number one pick, and then Donald Trump, and then Hillary Clinton is last. And so I would write somebody in before I'd vote for her.
What is your outlook for the rest of 2016 and, of course, looking ahead to 2017? Final thoughts and solutions for the American people?
Well, I think the economy continues to deteriorate until it eventually deteriorates faster, right? That's the direction we're going in. I don't believe we've ever really recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. I think all we did is blow a bigger bubble, but we never had a real economic recovery that raised the standard of living of the American people. In fact, the average American is worse off today than he was when the recovery started. And we've never had a recession that was worse. I mean, we never had a recovery that was worse than the recession that we're recovering from. And I tell people all along, if you thought this recovery was bad, wait till you get a load of the next recession, because this was the weakest recovery in the history of recoveries. And I think this next recession could be the worst recession ever. It'll certainly be worse than the Great Recession that we had in 08 and 09. And in fact, it may even be bigger than the Great Depression that we had in the 1930s. And so we're going to have to rename that.
All right, Peter, always a pleasure to have you on the Next News Network. Do you have any projects you're working on you want to plug real quick? Any books?
Well, no new books right now, but I think people should still read my most recent book, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, How to Save Yourself and Your Country. I revised it a couple of years ago, and it's as relevant now as when I first wrote it. And again, I'm always on the internet. People should check me out on my YouTube channel, The Schiff Report, at schiffradio.com, to listen to my podcasts and my video blogs. And don't forget, the most important thing you can do is to save yourself financially right now. We can't really do anything at the ballot box because we're going to be outvoted by a bunch of people who depend on government, most likely. But you can do something about your own personal finances. Contact me at my brokerage firm at Euro Pacific Capital at europac.com is our website, and get yourself some physical gold and silver. We've got the best prices at my gold company. Schiffgold.com is the website for my gold company.
All right. Those are the words of Peter Schiff, the American financial analyst, stockbroker, author, and CEO, Chief Global Strategist of Euro Pacific Capital. Peter, thank you for joining us once again on the Next News Network.
My pleasure.
Folks at home, please comment below, subscribe for updates, hit that share button. Let's get this message out to the social networks, because this is not stuff you're going to hear every day on the mainstream press. They're compromised, and we're bringing it to you here at the Next News Network. For the Next News Network, I'm Gary Franchi.